Yeah, I mean, I can say with confidence that the famous adage that World War II was won with British intelligence, American factories, and Soviet blood is, I think, really surprisingly accurate. What I like to tell them is, no, Stalin beat his wife. He didn't beat the Nazis. Hello there.
Hey, how are you?
Can you hear me well?
I can hear you just fine. And then
Uh,
give me 1 second. I'm just gonna check in on the Twitter, not Twitter, the YouTube and Twitch folks, and just tell them kind of what's up. So
sure.
yeah, so for whoever is just joining us on the stream, let me go ahead and check both ends. 1 second. Channel. Okay, so I know tonight was completely fucked up. We got like
Let
20
me go
people on
ahead
YouTube.
and
Check both ends.
Ooh,
One
no.
second. Channel audio. Okay, cool. Yeah, so hi to the 20 people on YouTube. We're normally up to 50. Sorry to the 10 people on Twitch. We're normally up to like 10 or 20. But basically, what happened was I was streaming earlier and got cut short. My mother in law did break her arm and is in the emergency room right now. My wife had to run out there in order to basically get her a Diet Coke and hang out with her while she's waiting to get seen. But the kiddos, I put the kiddo to sleep in the other room. So if he does come out, I am gonna have to run. But Mr. Hane over here, he was. We tried to talk last week, but unfortunately times didn't really work out that well. So I wanted to honor my word, hang out with my friends, and talk to Mr. Hane and Diagonal Dave tonight, if possible. So with all of that excuse making out of the way, Mr. Hane, how are you? Would you like to introduce yourself to the folks at home and kind of introduce what you want to talk about tonight?
Hello there. So my name is. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you fine. I'm
All
going to
right.
turn you a little bit
Perfect.
up on my end, but besides that, I think we're good to go.
Okay. So my name is Richard Hannay, or else you can call me George, which is my actual name. There aren't that many Richards in Greece, if I'm honest. So yeah, I am a military historian. I graduated from the University of Kent, and I'm going to pursue a master's in international relations. And basically, I've had a few talks with a variety of people about only about Ukraine, but further back in the day, I talked to Vosh about Golden Dawn, and I had a few other high-profile discussions. But ever since the whole crisis started in Ukraine, I was following it very closely. And I can say now that my claim to fame is on the 22nd of February. I said that I was 90 to 95% sure that it would start next week. And it started 2 days later.
Right.
So I can say that I predicted it. Hooray me. Um,
Yeah,
uh,
it's like yeah, I have
Pretty
this real
surprised.
knack for predicting human misery. Yes. So like,
Yeah,
but let me ask you this question because
of course.
I could potentially be familiar. Where is the school in Ghent? Is it in Belgium? Is it in a different? Is it in France? Where is it?
Not Ghent, Kent, in the
Kent.
UK.
Oh, okay. All right. Excellent. So, yeah, then no, that's a super cool academic background. I'm familiar with that as well. The reason why I was asking about Ghent was I'm pretty sure that was like a pseudo famous Belgian battle. So I was wondering if there was like some good college where they were like, hey, there's some real historic shit that happened here, so we're gonna make a war history college here for all the history nerds. But no, it is fascinating living in Europe versus being in the United States. The United States is a comparatively young country, and our history is pretty much there were Native Americans. We colonized this place. We killed the shit out of them, moved them to the reservation system. Then we had the cowboy and Civil War era. Then we had World War II. Like obviously, there's way more American history than that, but we're still a really young country without a lot of history. Whereas if you go to Europe, you can literally walk in places that have been fought over for millennia, and there's stories about those battlefields for millennia. So it's
That's
kind yeah, so it's kind of like it's kind of like being in like Narnia or like a fantasy country, you know. It's like what the you know it is
true.
crazy as an American to visit Europe and see all the battle sites.
Yeah, I did study one of the classes I did take was I think it was the history of the American Civil War, and
Mm,
I didn't look at the battles that much in that one because it was an elective
mm,
that had more to do with cultural history.
right.
Because with military history we mostly focused on war making, really.
Mm,
But it was a really interesting lesson. I took a look at Reconstruction and the events that led up to the Civil War. But yeah, I mean, I live in Athens, right? If I dig in my garden, I'll find a piece of like pottery that's older than your country.
right.
If I take a walk like 15 minutes from here, if I get into my metro, which we have, if I if I get into my metro, take a 15-minute ride to the center of Athens, I can look at the Acropolis, which
Right.
is a 2500 a 2500-year-old monument. So there's a lot to see
Right.
here, and the older buildings and the history is really all around you. But it's really sad with Athens because
Mm,
you'd guess that it's a city better preserved, but most of it is built in the 60s and 70s
mm,
because Greece was ravaged really badly. The 20th century wasn't a good century for Greece. We didn't only have the physical disaster, which mostly had to do with earthquakes and stuff. We also had the Nazis,
mm,
who, when they occupied Greece, it was a really brutal occupation. There was a partisan movement that fought really hard against the Nazis, and that had a lot of repercussions for the civilian population.
mm.
There a famine that Greece suffered through in 1941. Around 10% of our population died.
Wow.
Then a brutal civil war followed. So Greece does not actually. I don't know if you know this, but Greece does not actually celebrate Victory Day.
Hmm.
Uh, we don't have a celebration for Victory Day because for us the war didn't end until 1949.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting, and I think you'll really appreciate this, what we celebrate in Greece, we celebrate the 28th of October,
Okay.
because on the 28th of October 1940, um, the Italian foreign minister sent an ultimatum to the Greek dictator at the time, Ioannis Metaxas.
Mm,
And the ultimatum was basically, well, give up your arms and let Italian troops march through your country, which is basically capitulation,
mhm,
or it will be war. And the Greek prime minister slash dictator said, well, then it will be war. He said it in French. But what we know it as is No Day, the day where we got to say no to the Italian invaders, refuse the ultimatum. And that's how we celebrate World War II. We
mm.
celebrate saying no to the invading force.
Man, this stuff really messes me up because so being in the military, a lot of American supremacy on the battlefield has to do with psychology. Because when it comes down to it, there's 12 Americans with rifles going up against a few dozen enemy combatants with rifles, and then you add in all the technology and the air support and the tanks and this, that, the other thing that kind of gives America its edge. But really, uh, up until you're actually able to benefit from air support or artillery strikes or good communication or good tactics, it does boil down to confidence. And that's
Mm.
one of the things that I'm noticing. It could be propaganda, but I also think it's potentially real. Is the similar to the Greeks and similar to modern American military personnel? The Ukrainians seem to be really confident, and they seem to be willing to do things that I did not expect them to be willing to do. Whether that was like taking on Russians toe to toe or engaging in ambushes, I just didn't expect it. And so, do you have any insight on your perspective, like how much does, especially from a historical perspective, how much does psychology really count in warfare? Because oftentimes we treat these things like real time strategy video games.
So to be honest, what reigns supreme most often in war is the advantage in material,
Mm-hmm.
um, production capacity, and military hardware.
Mm-hmm.
But morale is extremely important, and you can see this most. I mean, the United States is actually a perfect example because you can see in the majority of the wars that the United States has fought in, going back to the 1960s up to today, it hasn't been the conventional aspect of the war that the United States has struggled with. It has
Mm-hmm.
been counterinsurgency.
Right.
And US troops have often suffered horrendous morale failures. And the reason for that is, sooner or later, US troops would recognize that, well, what are we doing here? We
Mm-hmm.
aren't really defending the homeland. We are engaging perhaps in nation building, but that's really abstract for the troops on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw, I mean, perhaps Vietnam is the greatest failure of morale from U.S. troops, where they got so angry at their superiors they would frag them,
Mm-hmm.
or they would engage in alcoholism and try and look for prostitution
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of the occupied places of Vietnam. And it was so hard because there wasn't an easy objective where you had the enemy in front of you and you could just blast them away, because the United States has always, especially in the modern era, the United States has had an overwhelming superiority of arms in almost every single conflict they have engaged in. Now, when it comes to morale, when it like in conventional war, so between two countries that are fighting on equal footing, morale is important and it can be the decisive factor. Um, but it is more often leadership and like material and production capacity. Because I
Well,
mean,
do
yeah.
you think I'm I yeah, I think I was probably poking at a rosier answer than than really necessary, because even I know this, like the history of the United States, at least from a military history perspective, because I did take a military history class.
Mhm.
The We like to think of World War II as like this big valiant psychological effort, but what you actually see is American production and America's ability to unify the Europeans and produce soldiers and equipment that just kept pushing Germany and Japan back. There was just no end to it. For instance, like one of the things that we discussed was the fact that the kamikazes were supposed to be this big psychological deterrent to the Americans because of just how fanatical the Japanese were. And it was. But at the same time, what happened is every time a Japanese pilot struck a ship, or every time a Japanese pilot died taking his plane down with them, Japan lost a plane and an experienced pilot that they weren't able to replace, whereas the Americans were constantly replacing their pilots and constantly replacing their airplanes. And so it just boiled down to a numbers game where the logistics were borderline inevitable on behalf of the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I can say with confidence that the famous adage that World War II was won with British intelligence, American factories, and Soviet blood is, I think, really surprisingly accurate.
Okay.
Um,
So I'm not going to push back, but I'm going to ask a question. So
sure.
the fuck. There's this meme where it's like what people think World War II is like, and it has a bunch of like
I know what
dinosaurs or
you're talking
whatever. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about?
Yes, yes, I know what
Yeah.
you're talking about. I
And
know the
then
meme.
but then the second meme is like what World War II was really like, and it's like 10,000 Russian velociraptors like swarming the German T-Rex, and then America in the corner like fighting Japan, and like the UK having like maybe one velociraptor or something like that. So the point being that the Soviets significantly contributed blood in order to defeat the Germans. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think is it something like 80% of German losses were on the
Yes,
Eastern Front?
yes, yes.
Okay.
What's really interesting about all these memes. I'll get to a gripe that I have with them later, but it's really interesting when you see how the war was fought in the East.
Mm-hmm.
It's not this the Russians throwing wave after wave after wave of infantry. For
Okay.
the majority of the German invasion of the East, and especially during the early offensives in Barbarossa, and then later trying to take Moscow and Stalingrad, the
Mm-hmm.
Germans actually had more soldiers in the
Mm-hmm.
East than the Soviets did. The Soviets did lose a lot, but they replaced a lot. So
Mm-hmm.
production capacity was also a big deal there. Now, a gripe that I have with all these memes is that a lot of people like to say, well, who won World War II? Well, some people say, oh, yeah, the Soviets did everything, oh, or the Americans did everything. For me, World War II was a collaborative effort
Mm-hmm.
where almost all the interconnecting pieces make it insanely, like they make it impossible to isolate which country won the war, quote unquote. I don't
Right.
think it's possible to do that, and I think it takes away from the effort that was World War II in defeating Nazism.
Oh, what 100%, and none of this means anything to a young infantryman who's participating in a single battle in World War II. So that's
Nope.
where I agree. I don't like the extrapolation of like national effort and then turning it as if it was a person into a single effort and then saying, "Oh, well, we did it or you did it or this that the other." Like I agree with it, it is childish. The reason why people engage in these things though is because they want to be the good guys, right? The United
Yeah.
States wants to be the good guys, the Russians want to be the good guys, and communist apologists want to say that it couldn't have been all bad because we helped defeat the Nazis, and these are the sacrifices that we were willing to make in order to defeat the Nazis. So
See,
the
to be fair,
mm,
sorry to
no,
interrupt you.
please go ahead.
Um, yeah, to be fair, what I really don't like, I mean, I think the contribution of the Soviet Union is really big in the victory against Nazi Germany, and of course their collaboration earlier was also a big factor in them getting as strong as they did. Um, what bothers me is a lot of people do the cult of personality thing where they
Hmm.
say Stalin beat the Nazis.
Right.
What I like to tell them is no, Stalin beat his wife. He didn't beat the Nazis. The, you're thinking of the workers and peasants of the Red Army. Those were the
Right.
guys who did the fighting.
Oh,
And the thing is, like, to be fair, I might be one of the more reasonable lefties, but I am a
mm,
lefty.
right.
Still, it bothers me a lot of the narrativizing and a lot of the I don't know. It feels like a lot of people talk about war and they turn it into like a story of like valiance and fighting and I get there's a lot of like story making to go around and I kind of like that sometimes but I want people when it's when it's happening when it's real to recognize that it's more complex that they'd like to think
Hmm.
um, and I think that we can segue that into Ukraine because although I love talking about the Ukrainian tractor memes,
Hmm.
there is there is a war going on in the ground, and I think it's a really interesting one. If I'm honest with you.
Yeah. So the just to speak to what you just said though briefly, one of the really frustrating things for me is there's a split on the right
Mhm.
between what I would call like maybe like liberals or libertarians, like people who actually value the Constitution and human rights and all that kind of stuff. And then there's just like Christian nationalists. There's just people who want a Christian theocracy and they don't care about any of that shit. And the Christian nationalists and the ethno nationalists seem to be coming out in favor of Russia unapologetically because they view it as a challenge to American liberal hegemony, personified by NATO. And so my extreme frustration with these people is that while they're smart, they're kind of doing like a really weird LARPy thing where they're like, we salute the Russians, we are brave boys
And
in
Nick
white, red,
Fuentes.
and blue. And it's like, motherfucker, like kids are getting artillery striked right now, and you're fucking larping about it on the internet. Like you're kind of fucking gross. Like fuck you.
Like the way I mean I'd think that like the nationalists or ethno-nationalists of the American far right would be in favor of Russia, not only because it's extremely socially conservative and anti-liberal, but I would also guess that what they see happening in Ukraine is a show of strength and
Mm-hmm.
strength of arms. I think that nothing gets a far right nationalist more hard than seeing a big military parade and tanks and artillery strikes. They don't want to see the victims,
Right,
but
right. They want to see
they
the
want to
symbols
see
of
the
power.
big guns, firing.
Yeah.
Um,
So, but before we move into the more serious shit, because I want to hear your breakdown. But at the
sure.
same time, speaking to that, I am seeing I don't know if I'm just consuming Russian propaganda or what, but it seems like there's a lot of incompetence on behalf of the Russian army, and it seems like there's a lot of issues where the logistics just aren't what they are supposed to be. So I guess if you want to launch into Ukraine however you want to from a narrativized format, that would be fine, and I would love to hear it. But also, while you're wrapping it up, if you could speak to the kind of like the Russian incompetence that I'm seeing, because we expected more out of Russia. I'm not gonna lie. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, they thought that the invasion would go well. We're gonna make the flashy moves. We're going to drop paratroopers near Kiev. We're going
Mm-hmm.
to move our armored columns up to the cities, and the Ukrainian army will fold and surrender. We're gonna do some major strikes with precision weapons, maybe some electronic warfare here and there. I think that the Russian army, its initial push in was one that where they expected a surrender to come, and
Mm-hmm.
that's why their logistics couldn't hold up. Especially in the first week, they had horrendous logistical issues.
Mm-hmm.
It is less so the case now because it seems like they're moving towards Plan B, which
Mm-hmm.
is acting like the Russian army tends to act, especially with their modern doctrine. I think a really good analog would be looking at the war in Chechnya, where they drove three armored columns into Grozny. They got decimated by RPGs firing from rooftops,
Mm-hmm.
and then they moved out. And what they did is they dug in around Grozny and turned it to rubble using artillery, strategic bombers, and multiple launch rocket systems.
Do you think
So,
that's what's coming next?
oh, I think that definitely is what's coming next. If Ukraine continues to
Continues to
resist, they,
resist.
which they will, they absolutely will, and I expect them to, and they should for the moment. Um, Now, oh, interestingly, you know about the cope cages?
Cope cage. Oh, what
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The slat
the
armor.
fucking.
Yeah,
Oh yeah, because that isn't that supposed to be like cope cages.
yeah.
Nice.
That's the colloquial. Yeah. To be fair, it's now in Wikipedia, so we can call them cope
Ah,
cages.
that's fucking hilarious. But like, okay,
Yes.
okay. So I just want to explain it so I can make it hopefully, or so I'll explain it incorrectly and then you correct me. So there's kind of
Sure.
like this like grill system, and they actually have it on American systems as well. And the theory behind it is that they're supposed to catch like a rocket propelled grenade on the exterior of the vehicle, so it doesn't actually make contact with the armor. It detonates before it hits the armor, and as a result, since it's a premature detonation, it doesn't do as much damage. Is did I call it correctly, or am I incorrect?
I mean, generally, the slat or cage at the standoff is usually meant for heat ammunition. Either it
Mm-hmm.
would be heat fired from so that would be heat is high explosive anti-tank.
Mm-hmm.
And also RPGs are heat projectiles. They basically, the way they work is they are imagine a rocket but with an inverted cone shape,
Yep.
where once it smacks onto the metal of the armor, it shoots a jet of like really high pressure and like hot, like I don't know what you'd call it. It's a jet anyway, and it
Mhm.
pierces through a really thick amount of steel. Now the thing is, if you have that space being empty, the jet doesn't change. So if you have like a meter of empty space, that's better having than having a meter of steel,
Mhm.
because the meter of steel is really heavy. The meter of empty space is really light. Now, with the slat armor cope cages on the Russian tanks, a lot of people were talking about them being meant to stop javelins,
Mm.
but that's
No.
definitely not the case. They cannot stop javelins. What I thought, and I saw a really good explanation for it, is that they were meant to avoid situations like Grozny,
Yes.
so where they got shot from RPGs from rooftops, especially because in Ukraine there's a lot of these old commie blocks, which are fairly sturdy buildings
Mhm.
and fairly tall buildings, that when a general airstrike takes place, not all of them will be destroyed, but because there's like hundreds of them, thousands maybe in a few cities. So they expected to be shot with RPGs from rooftops. So I guess once we saw they installed that they had been installing cope cages, we should have been able to tell that an invasion is coming.
Mhm.
Actually, um, so now, specifically, when it comes to what they did next, what followed up after the initial stage of the invasion, is they moved in pretty fast, so the rear security was really bad.
Mhm.
So they left behind a lot of irregulars and Ukrainian units that would ambush Russian convoys, and that's
Mhm.
how we saw all the devastated convoys. But the thing is,
They're
on
shoring it
our,
up.
yeah, on our side of Twitter, we're going to see a lot of the positive news, way
Mhm.
more than the negative news. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't think I've seen a single Twitter post about the losses of the Ukrainian army.
Right.
Have you seen one?
No.
Yeah.
I've seen basically, yeah. As a matter of fact, the only dead Ukrainians I've seen have been civilians.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the like the Ukrainian
Information
well,
warfare,
information war.
propaganda
Yes.
war.
Exactly. It's part of saying, well, every Russian bomb will hit a hospital and a school. It's not
Mhm.
going to hit any military units. Uh
Can
but the
I?
Russian,
I want to express
yeah,
some frustration.
mhm,
The
of course.
a lot of right wingers were like, "Oh, well, it's propaganda." It's like, no shit, motherfucker. They're fighting a
Yeah.
goddamn existential war for their fucking country. You think they're gonna come out and say, "Oh yeah, we've lost shitloads of fucking people. We've lost shitloads of materiel. We're ready to surrender." Like, get the fuck out of here. You know,
Yeah,
like
I
that.
mean,
That's so
you should
frustrating
expect
to
that.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You should expect that like you can't, for example, look at what the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine says when it comes to like military losses and how much they've killed, how many Russians they've killed, because they're gonna play up how many they've killed and play down how many they've lost, because that's what ministries of defense do in every single
Right.
war.
Right.
It's
And
part
then
of the information war. Yeah.
well, and likewise, so this is the funny thing. The Ministry of Defense for Russia, they they kept showing like helicopter footage of them landing and blowing shit up or whatever, and I was like, okay, the blowing shit up, that's okay, I guess. But then the landing supported some of my earlier, I guess you would call them criticisms of what I expected out of the Russian military.
Mhm.
And this is from a American perspective, so maybe it's ignorant of me to expect them to have like identical tactics to us, but at the same time, it's like we spent shitloads of blood and treasure on developing our tactics, and the how do I phrase this? The A lot of this information is available for free online because American veterans love to fucking talk about ambushes and marksmanship and what we used to do and this, that, the other. So I was expecting the Russians to like kind of re-engineer our own tactics because they're fucking good. And instead, I saw helicopters landing by themselves without air support under Ukrainian fire on like major material objectives. And that's not how Americans fight at all. Like Americans have like we'll get air supremacy first. We will have fighter jets and air support both anti-air and anti-ground support on standby. We will move our infantry in super quick with mechanized infantry like transports either by helicopter or by ground. And all of this works together to make sure that we're minimizing our casualties and maximizing the casualties of the enemy. And I didn't see that at all this past week. I just saw Russians fucking bum rushing Ukraine and getting fucked up. So,
Yeah, I mean, really interesting. I mean, you can look at the difference between the invasion of Iraq
mhm.
in
Which was a bum
yeah,
rush, but we had a shitload of like a shitload of like interacting technologies.
yeah. I mean, like the United States spent, what was it, a week or two,
Mm,
initially just doing the shock and awe campaign, bombing the ever living crap out of any military infrastructure that existed in Iraq.
right.
Now that that shows the difference in the mentality of the Russians. They didn't open with a huge bombing campaign because they thought that the Ukrainians would surrender, and that
Mm,
speaks a lot to the initial, I don't know, flashy but ineffective things they did in the early days of the war,
mm,
where they dropped, for example, the paratroopers in Hostomel Air Base, which was 120 kilometers away from like 80 miles away from their closest heavy units. So they dropped the
Jesus.
paratroopers there, and those paratroopers, what, how many did they drop? Maybe 800, maybe 1,000, maybe 1,500. What will these paratroopers do the moment like a moment a brigade comes around of like Ukrainian regulars supported by tanks and artillery? Those guys are fucked. They
Mm,
can't do anything. Like, they can be as elite as they want. You're all equal in the face of artillery. Okay, you you can be the most well trained, like the most like badass gun hose like VDV soldier you want. You will die
mm,
if you drop like this. So they didn't use the VDV the way you'd expect them to use the VDV. So like capturing railway bridges or like strategic locations, they so that those could meet up with heavy columns, as that's what paratroopers are meant to do. They used them as shock troops and they died. So now you don't see them dropping the VDV anymore with aircraft. What you see them is using the VDV as regulars in the front line, moving them around like grounded units, basically.
Did
Um,
do you the Ukrainians are as far as I can tell, I don't know when their stockpiles will run out, but it
mhm.
seems like they have quite a long supply of man portable anti air and man portable anti tank weapons. And
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
kind of wanted to point out too earlier, it's like, why is the slat armor not working against javelins? The reason why is because a javelin is actually designed very specifically to counter tank armor. There's
Yep, they're
actually,
tandem shape.
yeah,
They're
there's
tandem explosives. Yeah.
yeah, so not just that, but there's also like there's two attack vectors for a javelin. One of them is like anti-infantry or straight on, where literally the missile just comes at you and hits you. And then the other one is the like anti-tank vector, where it literally like it goes up and then it comes back down, and the intention is to hit the tank in a different position, so the armor isn't as capable of being defended against. You're not hitting as hard of a point in order to basically defeat the tank armor. So that's
Mhm.
where for me they've taken a Ukrainian guerrilla or a Ukrainian soldier and they've made him incredibly powerful. And I'm kind of wondering, the way that I was always thinking about it with the war in Iraq was we spend literally $500,000 to $1 million to outfit a single platoon. And an Iraqi farmer insurgent can blow up the $200,000 truck that America is buying with
And
$50 of
RPG.
home, yeah, like an RPG or $50 of homemade explosives, right? So the
Yes.
math from a logistical perspective just doesn't work, and it kind of depends on who's willing to fight the longest, who's going to win. And obviously we kind of know how that shook out. So do
Mm.
you see the Ukrainians being able to inflict enough losses that they can negotiate some kind of diplomatic settlement, or do you think the Russians are going to be like, okay, we kind of showed our ass a little bit, but we're ready now, and we'll basically start fucking everybody up, and they'll come to the table because we're going to mean serious business after a couple of weeks of getting our shit together.
So this is the really interesting part because I think right now we're at the crossroads of what the campaign can look like.
Mm-hmm.
The Russians are suffering horrendous material losses. But they can sustain them for a little while. Not forever, of course. Nobody can sustain extreme losses forever, but they can sustain them for a little while. And their economy will also hold up for a while, even though the Western sanctions have been pretty heavy. They are still like selling natural gas and oil, and are making like $750 million dollars a week, like a day or something, some crazy amount. So they're going to hold up for a while. The man pads and portable ATGMs that the Ukrainians are using are really good, especially the javelins and the NLAWs, the British NLAWs. Those are really good, but I think now in the new package that the United States is sending, I think they're sending the 84s.
Mm-hmm.
Is that how they're called? That are kind of junk, from what I understand. They're good
They're
at.
junk, but they're super cheap.
Yeah, 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 yeah. They're
That
really. I mean, it won't
for what
matter
they
if it.
are. Yeah,
Yeah,
and just to explain this, so this was kind of like the man portable anti tank rocket that was common for the Americans. And it is our cheapest anti tank asset by far. Like I think it's literally like $5,000 or six
single
thousand
use.
dollars. Yeah, so it's single use, and it does kind of what you were saying with the jet. So it makes
It's a
impact.
heat breath. Yeah.
Yeah, it makes impact. It how do I phrase this? The cone. So there's an explosive behind a copper jet, and then that explosive basically drives the metal jet through the armor. But that's the thing is, compared to a whole tank, like a T-14 Armada or a T-80V or whatever the fuck they have right now, I don't know if it might be enough to knock off a track. It might be enough to kill the crew, but I don't know if it's enough to like basically completely disable a modern tank. It
Yeah,
will be effective against transports, and it will be effective against maybe disabling equipment so it's not useful anymore.
they will also be good against like armored personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles of
Right.
like the
Right.
BMDs and the BMPs and whatever else the
Right. So
Russians.
it's not anything to shake a stick at.
Yeah.
But what I would say is another thing too is the psychological aspect of it for me. Another reason why I brought that up earlier in the conversation is because
Mhm.
I think it's one thing. It's already terrifying going into a country in which you know that there are people who are actively planting bombs, like just to kill you. And
Yeah.
then there's like a 1 in a million chance of you getting blown up on the side of the road, right? That's already terrifying. What's more terrifying is being in a transport vehicle or a helicopter where you know that like the enemy has the technological capacity to knock you out before you even know that they're there. That's
Mhm.
fucking horrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that moves into like the whole can the Russians occupy Ukraine aspect, which I think like I'll get to that very shortly. But I think it would actually be good if we can bring up a map of Ukraine so that I can do a little bit of map painting so that I can like
Can you
show
can you
off.
bring it up on your stream or should
Yes,
I?
yes, yes, yes. I'll
Okay.
I'll do it. Give me a moment. Give me a moment. I'll bring up actually the Wikipedia map, which Russo-Ukrainian, just a second. The Wikipedia map for that of the Ukraine war is surprisingly accurate.
Nice. No, that's actually great. I was looking to see the progress of the war so far, and I wasn't
Mhm.
really finding a lot. But I am kind of oh no, I am kind of happy that somebody's doing it right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people that are creating maps. I'm looking at a lot of like analysts' maps.
Mm.
There's also like the Institute of the Study of War. There's a lot of there's a lot of people that are making some. nice maps, thankfully, so we
And
can look at
if I can bring this up because I have a feeling that you and I can talk for like ever.
yeah.
I do have another person at midnight tonight after you, but you know, obviously with the wealth of information that you're bringing, I'd be super happy to just like schedule you again because obviously
Sure,
we're having
if
fun and
you
we're both fucking nerds, so we could probably talk
yeah,
for
yeah,
like
if
hours.
you want to talk again, yeah, I mean, I trust me,
Because
I can
there's no
show you.
way we're gonna cover as much as I want to cover tonight. I'll put it that way. Like,
Right. So, can you see what I'm
I can,
showing?
I can.
Right. So
Yeah.
let me do my map painting. Actually, wait, no, I can't. I need to open with paint.
Well,
Um.
we can see your mouse cursor.
Oh,
Wait,
wait.
as a matter of fact, can you? Oh,
Let me
sorry.
close that. Give me a moment.
Uh huh.
I opened the I did the wrong capture. Give me a second.
Okay.
Now with paint. Now I can actually paint. Okay, there we go. So I think we can see it now, right?
Let me tab over because on my end it is. There we go. Yep, we're good.
Okay, great. So basically, the crossroads that I am worried about right now is the fact that after this war, yes, the fronts have stabilized quite a bit.
Mm,
There haven't been as significant movements in the previous days, but at the same time, the stalemate is really tentative,
mm-hmm.
especially because while the Ukrainian regulars are are heavily committed across the board, and so are the Russians, the problem is that the Russians are in a better position to recover and be able to concentrate forces in separate places because the Ukrainians, some of their soldiers that are currently occupying Russian resources are in certain pockets. So there's one in Chernihiv, there's one in Sumy, which is getting closed by the Russians,
Right.
and there's the other one down here in Mariupol.
Yeah. There,
So
Mariupol's
basically,
fucked. Yeah.
yeah, Mariupol is fucked. There's no way the Ukrainians can lift that siege. I think in the coming day, the Battle of Mariupol has reached its culmination. In the coming days, Mariupol will probably have to fall.
Yeah.
And the thing is, if these fall, right, the Russian units besieging those places
Free
will
up.
be freed up, but
Yeah.
the Ukrainian soldiers that are there won't be freed up. They will have to capitulate,
Mm-hmm.
which means that the Ukrainians will still be fully occupied, while the Russians will suddenly have free reserves.
Right.
So what I'm expecting the Russians to do in the coming days is basically people were talking about moves on Odessa from the sea,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but or moves around Kiev like this. But I don't see this happening. The reason I don't see this happening is because in the direction of Kiev, unless they can clear up the north,
Mm-hmm.
so basically, Chernihiv and Sumy, unless those are cleared up, the logistical situation in the north won't allow the units that are coming from the east to fully close the pocket. So even if the western forces are able to close it, the eastern ones won't be in as good a position. So here is where the like Russian logistics are suffering the most.
Mm-hmm.
So what I expect them to do is attempt to close off and encircle the units, the Ukrainian units that are sitting here. There's a bulk of Ukrainian units here that are aimed at the Donbass.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why those units are there is because some of the best defensive positions that Ukraine held from the 2014 war, and then the like following 8 years of conflict were in this region. So these cities are the ones that are some of the best defended cities.
They're
But at the
already
same,
militarized.
yes, yes, yes.
I was wondering that myself because I would have thought if I was the president or whatever, I'd have been like, fuck the East. Like we're gonna get fucked up. Bring everybody into the core so we can kind of like fight as one. But if those cities actually do have like a war footing, they've known that this has been going down for a while, if they have supplies prepared and defensive positions prepared, I'm sure that like the Russians will encircle, siege, and destroy them eventually if we're talking about like purely military, no diplomacy. But also, those might be really one super talented fighters, and then two, they might be the most logistically and defensively prepared forces in all of Ukraine.
So
So
yes, that's the issue, right? There's two problems with pulling these forces, say, behind the Dnieper,
yeah,
right?
you also
The
open them
the
up to ambush by air and artillery if they withdraw.
Exactly. So if you leave your prepared defensive positions, you have a problem. Suddenly, the Russian Air Force, which has almost total superiority over this area of Ukraine,
Hmm.
they will bomb you to shit if you move in columns like the Russians have been doing, right? Where they're
Right,
suffering from the Bayraktars, right? The
right.
Ukrainians have been doing those like hit and run tactics. They have been moving, like either not moving or preparing ambushes. So they haven't been doing these vast maneuvers, like say conducting big offensives or counteroffensives, because those will be much harder with Russian air superiority in much of eastern Ukraine. So first, it's really hard to move them. And second, it's politically difficult to move them because you're abandoning territory that you fought over
Hmm.
for a good chunk, right? They have fought over this territory for, oh my god, I put the
A decade,
Mariupol
two
wrong.
decades.
Mariupol is here, so like 8 years, right? They have
Hmm.
fought over this territory. They're not gonna abandon it. So what I'm
Hmm.
expecting the Russians to try to do, I think they're gonna try to cut off the Lysychansk pocket. So they're going to try to cut off the Severodonetsk Lysychansk pocket. And I think the big operation that they're planning now will be to cut off the Ukrainian forces here. But in order for this to take place, the Russian forces that are currently besieging Mariupol need to be
Hmm.
freed up. So unless these guys are freed up, this here is not happening. So
So
that's why.
Mariupol has to hold. What the
Yes,
fuck?
yes, exactly. Mariupol is really important to hold, as
God
are the northern cities, because if the northern cities fall, the Russians will be freed up to move on Kiev and
God
actually
damn it.
encircle Kiev. So that's the
That
issue.
do you know how hard that fucking depresses the shit out of me? Because basically, like, I was like, oh, Mariupol, it's gonna fall guaranteed. You know, fuck it. Like, it'll only be another couple of days before they surrender. But now you're basically saying that in order for the East to hold, which it has to, in order to
Yeah.
not allow a fucking what do you call it, like all of the Russian forces to be freed up and able to cut off the eastern approaches to Kiev, then basically Mariupol, they just have to suffer. Like they have to. Like
Yes.
it's
They
not
have
even a
to hold.
question.
And the problem is if they, I mean, if Mariupol falls and they manage to pull off this encirclement, we're talking about 40,000 Ukrainians here.
Right.
If they have to surrender because they don't get any supplies from the ground, I think that's basically game over.
Right.
Kharkiv will no longer, if the Russians basically take this territory, Kharkiv will be extremely exposed and they'll be able to move on bigger cities this way.
Right.
So for me, right, in the coming weeks, what we'll have to see is like if the Ukrainians manage to, I mean, I believe Mariupol will fall. So after the
Mm-hmm.
fall of Mariupol, we'll have to see if the Ukrainians can actually beat off these offensives. If
Mm-hmm.
these offensives don't materialize or they fail, I think that the Ukrainians will have a really strong hand in negotiations going forward, because I think that would basically mean that the Russian offensive is fully stalled. But if this happens, if they
Mm-hmm.
encircle the east, then the Ukrainians will be at a much, much harder position, because then it will be like a
It's just down
knock-on
to Kiev.
domino effect.
Yeah.
Yes, and then they'll move on Kiev, and if Kiev is encircled, it doesn't matter. It can be the most fortified city on earth. If you can't resupply it, people will run out of food and they'll run out of water, and then they're gonna be faced with no electricity, no food, no water, and just Russian artillery just pounding you all day long. And the
Right.
thing is, like the Ukrainian military right now is really heavily invested in this direction, holding back the Russians, and they're really heavily invested here as well. and they're really heavily invested in Mykolaiv, and they're heavily invested in Odessa, and they're heavily invested in Kirovri and Nikolopol. So they have all these directions that they need to take care about, and the defense holding, and Kharkiv, of course. So the defense holding up really depends on the Russians not gaining a material upper hand in any position, which
Right.
is frankly really difficult, especially since some of the Ukrainian forces that are tidying up Russian forces are encircled. And in the coming days, we've seen that the Belarusian army has also been mobilizing,
Right.
and some think that they'll move on from over here from Brest down south to cut off supplies coming from the west. So I'm gonna move
Fucking
here,
hell.
and the Western supplies are coming in. So if this materializes, this attack, or the Russians break through Kirovri or Nikolopol and manage to cut off Dnipro and Zaporozhye, a lot of the supplies that are now flowing into the east will
Mm-hmm.
also be disrupted. So the east can collapse in two ways: either the big offensive, which is uh, this one, or the smaller offensive, which is this one.
Do you?
And
Mm-hmm.
either way that the Russians choose to do this, they'll first have to take Mariupol, because taking Mariupol will free up around 14,000 Russian soldiers, and of course the I think what is it 4 or 5,000 defenders will have to lay down their arms. So this means that that's how I see the war going in the coming days.
Yeah. Can
But
I?
if the
Mm,
Ukrainians win here, if the Ukrainians win here, I think they'll have the upper hand. Yeah, go
okay.
ahead.
So what I was gonna say, God, Godspeed to the Ukrainians on the Eastern Front. But the one
Godspeed.
thing that I heard that actually does make me nervous, as if this entire situation didn't make me nervous, is the
Mm,
fact that there's a lot of things that have to go right for the Ukrainians, and there's only a few things that have to go right for the Russians. And what I
yeah.
mean by that is, if Mariupol is freed up, they can move on the eastern territories. If the eastern territories are freed up, they can move on Kiev. If the Belarusian army cuts off the supplies to Kiev, then Kiev's fucked. And so, basically, even if the east holds, and even if Mariupol holds for like another month, but the Belarusian army is able to successfully cut off the resupply to Kiev, then at that point, it is just a matter of siege and time. And then it becomes a question of, are there enough forces in the West that can fight off the Belarusian forces? Are the Belarusian forces as well trained as Russians, as well supplied as Russians, or
They're not.
it? What's that?
The Belarusian army is like fairly weak. It only numbers a total of like 50,000 troops, but the
Mm-hmm.
issue is the Ukrainians are heavily committed, so the defenses here are going to be fairly ad hoc. There's
Mm-hmm.
probably going to be some army units in Lviv. Where's Lviv? It's somewhere, I think, like down
There's
here.
there's a lot of civilians in Lviv, and
Yeah, there's also, yeah, the refugees moving along and the supplies moving in. So it will be really, really bad if the Belarusians, but I don't trust the Belarusian army with anything really big,
Mhm.
because not only is their morale horrendous, way worse than the Russians,
Yeah.
the regime in Belarus is really unstable and really unpopular. So
So if
if
they
the
send
army
off
moves
tens of
out,
thousands of young men to die, then that's probably not going to be a good move for them.
yeah, but at the same time, you don't know, like we this war is unfolding in a matter of days and weeks, and a collapse of any of the like the aggressors could take months, which is a
Mhm.
problem. It is a problem because I don't know how long Ukraine has. Of course, they've had their own losses. They like their armored forces have suffered to an extent, and you can give a lot of NLAWs and javelins and 84s, but they are good for fighting an insurgency. They're not as good for fighting like completely beating back a big army or launching like a huge offensive, right? Because the
Well,
Ukrainians can defend very well, but launching a big offensive is harder.
Well, and that's actually something that I was wondering. So again, this is all fog of war. This is all bullshit. This
Yeah,
is
of
all
course.
speculation and opinion and all that kind of stuff. But basically, what somebody said was, "Hey, be on the lookout for a Ukrainian offensive in like April and May." And I was like, "An offensive? Like, are you fucking kidding me? Like, just dude, just hold on and negotiate. Kick the fucking Russians' teeth in so they feel like they just have to take Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea, and then leave you the fuck alone to do whatever you want. That would be my recommendation, not a fucking offensive. But if
I
they're
would
sorry, what's
uh,
that?
yeah, I would definitely agree because can you imagine the devastating blow to morale that a major offensive leading to failure would be if like because fighting like a guerrilla war, like kind of shooting ambushes, like defending cities, that stuff can be done fairly easily. And you can look really heroic and tough doing it. But like launching a big offensive where you might get heavily harassed by the Russian Air Force, that can be a big problem. And if that falls apart, you have really precious like reserves of like trained manpower and equipment that you cannot afford to throw away in an offensive that might not lead to a decisive change in the situation. So I really think that the Ukrainians need to hold on. Now, I think that's something really important to note as a last thing before I go.
Hmm.
um, if the Russians actually outright win, let's say the Ukrainian government collapses and they go into an occupation of the whole country will be, I think, nearly impossible. Like
Hmm.
in terms of manpower committed and logistics, we're talking about a country of 44 million. Unless you want to leave big parts of the countryside to insurgents or to self-management, um, then you won't be able to do this. But at the same time, it's Ukraine is not as hard to occupy as say Afghanistan or Iraq. I wouldn't say it is actually a bit more similar to Iraq than it is to Afghanistan because Ukraine is really flat. It has some forests and more mountainous regions here. Um, but it's really flat and there's a lot of cities and the Russians now in the last week and couple of weeks they have been moving in units of their national guard, their Rosguardia,
Hmm.
and they have been putting them in cities, and with the help of the FSB they have already started doing anti-partisan operations. So I
Right.
think especially down south, if the Russians are to negotiate, they really want this. This this is a big prize for the Russians, and I don't think they will be willing to give this up unless they really fail in the coming weeks. So yeah, main thing to look for
Hmm.
is this offensive in the coming days.
Well, so let me ask you that question. So
Sure. Yeah.
basically, where you've drawn the Ukrainian defensive line, and let's say south of that, right? So let's use the river as a border, as a new border.
Um.
Yeah. So
Here.
yes. So do you think that the current yellow and the current red that
Hmm.
is south and east of that blue line, do you think that is enough for Russia to be satisfied with their operation?
So Russia taking all this.
Not necessarily all that. The yellow part could stay Ukrainian. But the
This.
but yeah, all the stuff that's already red.
I think that if I mean, considering how poorly their war has gone,
Mm-hmm.
I think that taking this, they'll be fairly happy about if they manage to get a negotiation out of the Ukrainian government. But the thing is,
Why wouldn't the Ukrainian government concede on that stuff though? Because basically, for me, like you said, there's so many things that can go wrong for the Ukrainians. Why wouldn't you just say, okay, you take Donbass, Luhansk, you take everything east of the river, south of this city, and then we'll drop new borders. We'll probably militarize them. We promise to stay neutral, but then realistically, like, not.
Okay,
Like,
so the thing is, like, there's a couple of reasons why this hasn't happened. First of all, the Ukrainian army has seen success in the field for the most part so far. The other part is, if you just say now, without a big major Russian breakthrough, say that you now went on and said, okay, Russia, come to the negotiating table, we're giving you like like a big chunk of the country. Here you go, all yours. That'll be a major Ukrainian political defeat.
do
Like,
you do you
I
think
don't think
that
Zelensky survived that.
that's actually super interesting to me because as an outsider or as a foreigner, I'm kind of reading the writing on the wall as far as like what's militarily achievable. So I am consistently surprised by the willingness of Ukrainians to continue fighting because it's like, dude, like they're gonna fucking strangle you and bash your head against the wall, and they're like, yeah, well, I'm gonna gouge his fucking eyes out, and it's like, okay, bro, like you fucking do you. Like it's just surprising. Um, their will to fight. It's not that I thought Ukrainians were pussies. I never thought they were pussies, but like I didn't expect them to hold, and two, I didn't expect them to be so willing to continue to try to hold.
Mm.
So for instance, like reclaiming Donbass and Luhansk or whatever, or Donetsk and Luhansk, that's not going to happen. Like even like you will not, there will not be enough Western support in the world, enough money or javelins or anti-air missiles. There's not enough missiles in the world for the Ukrainians to retake Donetsk and Luhansk. So just fucking write it off. And then when it comes to like Crimea and the southern regions or whatever, it's pretty clear that what Russians want, at least me reading it geopolitically, is like they want access to the Black Sea and they want clear access to Crimea. So here you go, motherfuckers. This is yours. We keep Odessa. We keep everything east or everything west of basically that defensive line that you have in the east. And we won't join NATO, but guess what? We're going to be militarizing for the next decade because we don't trust that not going to try again. That would be my
Yeah,
thing.
I think that what the Ukrainians are willing to concede in negotiations will have to do a lot with their position militarily,
Mm-hmm.
and how well they hold. That's why if this offensives fall, they'll be in a better shape. The Ukrainians will be in a better shape to get smaller like concessions out of Russia. Basically, what I expect is if these fail, I think the Ukrainians will say, okay, we'll recognize Crimea or recognize Donetsk and Luhansk. We'll drop Western sanctions and you leave. And the Russians might be willing to accept that as like a victory, right?
Right.
But if the situation gets worse and the Russians start controlling like really big parts of the country, or if they cut off Kiev, um,
Yeah.
like it'll be harder. But now, like talking to the mentality specifically of like fighting against like almost impossible odds, um I guess like it's really interesting to me because like it's a different perspective, because like when it comes to like the United States, like in say the 20th century, the United States has never had to deal with that kind of existential like threat to its existence. Like almost every war that the United States has fought, it has been in like another country. All right, like I think you can see it the same way as like the Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
I think Ho Chi
Home
Minh said,
turf.
yeah, home turf, you're fighting for your field. And not only are you fighting for your field, you know that that your invader only has a limited will. They can't hold
Uh,
forever. And if the Russians overshoot and they say, okay, we're gonna take this part, and you're gonna have a puppet government in Kiev. The Ukrainians might say, "Fuck it, we're not gonna give you an inch." And if our government collapses and our military collapses, we're gonna keep fighting a guerrilla war until you leave. And
right.
I think the Vietnamese in a way fought a similar war. I think Ho Chi Minh, I think, said that like, okay, they want to kill 1 million Vietnamese, killing 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 Americans. will have the same effect. We can lose 1 million and we won't be deterred. And I think he said that, if it takes 20 years, we'll come and negotiate in 20 years. And it really shows that, like, if you're willing to fight that kind of war, and there are a lot of countries that have done this before, like fighting against like impossible odds, often losing, the conventional war, and then winning the insurgency. I think that the Ukrainians are in a position to do this, but I do want the war to end in a negotiate. I mean, ideally, I would want the Ukrainians to just like kick the Russians out. But since this isn't happening, I want the war to end in a negotiation with favorable terms to the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Because if the Russians like take over the whole country, we're gonna see bloodshed on an insane scale.
Yeah.
It won't be like the occupations, say, of Iraq and Afghanistan. It will be worse. I think I can say that with a fair amount of confidence. Um,
Well, and I do have to run, but there was a
yes.
there. I want to end on this note. There was a saying in Afghanistan, which I don't know if it's propaganda or not, but it was something that the Afghans allegedly said, which
Hmm.
was, "You have the watches, we have the time." And to kind of speak,
Oh, that's good.
yeah, kind of speaking to the mentality of, we have the technology, we have the, we have all our like industrialized modern, technology in order to try to get things done, but realistically they got the patience. And if you see that in Afghanistan and if you see that in Iraq, it turned out to be completely true. So God forbid, I hope it doesn't come down to that, but
I do
if it
hope it
does,
does.
then it
Yeah.
is what it is. But yeah,
So,
I do have to run to my other friend. Can
of
you
course, you
shout yourself out and we can do this again?
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I'm Richard Haney 17 on Twitter. You do follow me there. So at Richard Haney 17, because of course you give follow backs to everything. Um, let's be fair. But like, yeah. Last thing, if you want to talk again either about Ukraine or you want to talk about, say, like the American counterinsurgency and occupations in Afghanistan, in like what else, like Vietnam, Iraq. I've written like some papers on like the political considerations and the military aspect of fighting counterinsurgencies, which I think you would find really interesting stuff to talk about.
It is my bread and butter. The
Yeah, yeah,
danger, the reason why I warned you of the 10 minutes, because I was like, I could talk to this motherfucker for 2 hours. I already felt that. But
yeah.
yeah, I got to run, buddy. It was beautiful,
Right,
and we'll do it again soon.
right then. See you later. Bye bye.
All right, catch you.